You are sitting in the back corner of a closed restaurant at 2:17 in the morning, and the overhead light above you is flickering the way lights do in places that have witnessed too many quiet conversations. The chairs are still upside down on every table except yours. There is a glass of water in front of you that nobody told you to drink, and a man named Caruso is standing near the kitchen door with his hands folded in front of him like a man waiting for a bus, which is somehow the most terrifying thing you have ever seen. Across from you, in the booth seat where the red vinyl is cracked down the middle like a dry riverbed, there is an empty space where a man named Dario was sitting 40 minutes ago. Nobody has explained where Dario went. Nobody's going to. The three other men in the room are not looking at you because they do not need to. They already know you are not going anywhere. There's a gold lighter sitting on the table between your hands, and it is not yours, but everyone in this room is waiting for you to pick it up and decide something. You do not know yet what the decision means. That is the most honest thing you can say about tonight. You do not fully understand what you are deciding, only that the wrong answer will reach further than this room, further than this city block, all the way back to a small apartment on Meridian Street, where your younger brother Marcus sleeps with the television on because the silence makes him nervous. You think about Marcus. You think about how none of this started with a choice. It started with an envelope and a wrong door. The truth about how people end up inside things they cannot escape is that they almost never walk through a gate with a lock on it. They walk through an open door on a cold night and feel the warmth of the room and decide to stay just a moment longer. Nobody joins a trap. They find shelter in it first, and by the time they understand the difference, the door behind them has already learned their weight. Let me take you back. Let me go back to the version of you who was just a person. That person existed. He was real. He was exhausted and stretched thin across a life that never quite fit. But he was real, and he was not yet anyone's instrument. It was a Tuesday in late October, 7 months ago, when you were working the late delivery shift for a courier service operating out of a shared dispatch center on Kellner Avenue, southeast side of the city. The job paid $11 an hour plus mileage, which sounds functional until you calculate the cost of the gas you used getting the mileage, and then the math starts bleeding. You had been at that job for 14 months. Before that, 3 months at a warehouse on the North Docks, and before that, 6 months at a restaurant on Clement Street where you bussed tables and occasionally washed dishes and learned that people leave remarkably little gratitude alongside their tips. You were 26 years old and your back already ached by noon each day, and your phone screen had a crack running diagonally across the lower left corner that you kept meaning to replace. You never replaced it because every time you had the $40 available, something more urgent arrived. The phone became a kind of measure of your circumstances. Every time you looked at it, the crack reminded you where you stood. Marcus was 19. He had a community college enrollment that he attended about 60% of the time. Because the other 40%, he was working at a grocery warehouse to help cover the rent after your mother's medical expenses began arriving in their crisp white envelopes. Your mother, Denise, had been managing a kidney condition for 3 years. Managing, meaning carefully monitoring what she ate and drank, carefully timing her medications, carefully avoiding the stress that the bills themselves created, which was its own quiet cruelty. The medical debt had accumulated to a number you kept written on a piece of paper folded in your wallet. Not because you needed reminding, but because there was something about seeing the number written in your own handwriting that kept the urgency feeling real rather than abstract. You needed the urgency to feel real. It was the only fuel you had. The delivery bag you carried on your routes was red nylon with a white logo on the flap. You had carried it so many days that the shoulder strap had started to fray at the buckle, and you had wrapped a piece of electrical tape around the weak point to hold it together. That bag went everywhere with you. It smelled like cardboard and cold nights and takeout containers. It was the most constant object in your life. On the night of October 22nd, at approximately 11:40 in the evening, you were running a late dispatch to the Harwick district, a cluster of commercial buildings pressed together near the waterfront where several restaurants operated their delivery windows until midnight. Your second to last stop was listed as Carmine's, a small Italian place on the corner of Harwick and Strand. The delivery was a sealed envelope, which happened occasionally, not often, but occasionally, and you had learned not to ask questions because the dispatch operator, a tired woman named Gloria who always sounded like she was answering calls from a room where someone else was trying to sleep, had told you early on that some clients sent documents between business addresses and you were not a postal inspector. You understood that to mean do not ask. So you did not ask. The back entrance to Carmine's was through an alley that connected to Strand Street, and the building directly behind Carmine's shared the same alley wall. There were 2 doors facing each other across that narrow passage, both black metal, both without visible signage, both lit by a single amber bulb mounted above the frame. You had been to Carmine's before, but always through the front. On that night, your dispatch note said rear entrance and you were 12 minutes behind schedule. And the crack on your phone screen had made the map slightly harder to read in the bottom left quadrant where the building numbers appeared. You went through the wrong door. It was that specific. It was that unremarkable. You knocked, someone opened it from the inside, you held out the envelope, and then you saw what was happening in the room behind them and your body understood it before your mind did. The way bodies always know things faster than the mind is willing to admit. You cannot describe exactly what you saw because even now, months later, it lives in you as a feeling more than an image. There were 4 men around a low table. One of them had blood on his shirt, and he was sitting very still in the way that people sit when they are being told to sit very still. There were documents on the table, and there was a weight to everything in the room, a particular gravity that made the air feel pressurized. The man who opened the door looked at you. He looked at the envelope. He looked at you again, and then he stepped back and said, quietly, "Come in. You should have run." You want to be honest with yourself about that? Your legs knew they should run. But there is a specific kind of paralysis that comes from being suddenly placed in a room where the social rules you have always relied upon are completely absent. And in that paralysis, your feet move forward because someone calm and well-dressed told them to. That is how it began. Not with a threat, with a door held open and a measured voice. The man who came to speak with you 3 days later was not the man from the doorway. He was older, perhaps 55, with silver at his temples and a charcoal coat that looked like it cost more than 2 months of your rent. He was waiting outside your apartment building when you came home from your shift at 12:30 in the morning. He was standing under the awning with the patience of someone who had made a study of patience. And when he saw you, he smiled the way people smile when they have been expecting you and are simply glad the waiting is over. He knew your name. He said it as a greeting, not a question. He said it with the kind of casual familiarity that suggested he had known it for longer than 3 days. Which you would understand more fully later. He said his name was Mr. Benedetti, and he said it the way a person introduces himself at a neighborhood meeting, comfortable and unhurried. He asked if you had eaten. You had not. He gestured toward a diner on the corner and said the coffee was better than it looked. You went because you were afraid not to. You went because some part of your mind, the part still pretending the situation was ordinary, told you that going with him to a diner was safer than standing in the dark, refusing. You went, and you sat across from him in a yellow plastic booth and he ordered 2 coffees without asking what you wanted. And he looked at you for a long moment before he spoke, and when he spoke, it was not about the room or the door or the envelope. It was about your mother. He mentioned her full name. He mentioned the name of her condition and the approximate amount of the outstanding medical debt. He said it all with the same gentle expression you might use when telling a friend you are sorry for their difficulty. And then he said that these things could be made easier. He said he understood what it meant to carry weight that was not yours to carry alone. He said he admired how hard you worked. He said that a person like you deserved better circumstances. You told yourself it was just conversation. You told yourself that none of it was an offer because an offer would require you to say yes, and you had not said yes to anything. But by the end of that coffee, you had said yes. Not loudly, not with full knowledge of what you were agreeing to, but you had said yes in the way that desperate people say yes, which is by not finding the strength to say no when warmth is being placed in front of them on a cold night. The first favor was straightforward. A sealed envelope delivered to an address on Dunmore Street. That was all. You were told nothing about the contents. You told yourself that you were a courier. You were doing what you already did every day. You were paid $400 in cash for what amounted to a 20-minute detour. $400. You held those bills in your hand that evening and thought about your mother's face and the number in your wallet. And the money felt like something you had earned rather than something you had accepted from a man whose business you were choosing not to examine. That willful blindness was the first version of your guilt, though you would not name it that for several weeks. The second favor arrived 11 days later. It was not about delivering anything. It was about confirming something. A man named Rossi called you on a number you had not given anyone and asked if you could tell a specific person, if that person called the dispatch center where you worked, that you had been on a route near Garfield Park between 9 and 11 on a Thursday evening 3 weeks prior. You had not been near Garfield Park that evening. You had been at the hospital visiting your mother, sitting beside her bed while she watched a game show with the sound too low to properly hear. You said yes. You said you could do that. When you hung up, you sat in your car for 11 minutes before you started the engine. The guilt of the envelope had been abstract. The guilt of the lie sat in your chest like something swallowed wrong. The third favor is the one you do not speak about directly. It involved driving a man you did not know to a location you were given, turn by turn, waiting outside in your car for 40 minutes while the streetlights hummed and then driving that man back to a parking garage on the east side. You did not ask what happened inside the building. You were paid $800. The man in your back seat said thank you when he got out, and his voice was perfectly normal. And that normalcy was somehow the most disturbing part of the entire evening. Each time, there was more money. Each time, you told yourself you could stop. Each time, stopping felt further away than it had the time before. Marcus noticed before anyone else. He was 19, but he was not unobservant, and one evening in December, he came into the kitchen while you were paying bills online, paying them ahead of schedule for the first time in years, and he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed and said, "Where is this coming from?" You told him you had picked up extra hours. He looked at you the way younger siblings look at older ones when they know they are being managed rather than told the truth. He said, "Extra hours where?" You said, "Just route work, some private clients." He said your name the way your mother used to when she wanted you to understand she was serious. He said, "Tell me what is going on." And you lied to him with complete fluency, and the lie came out smoothly because you had been practicing a version of it for weeks, and the smoothness of it horrified you more than the lie itself. The lie felt like losing something you had not known you still had. There was a night in early January when you called Marcus from outside the apartment because you could not immediately bring yourself to go inside. It was 11 degrees and you sat on the front step with your delivery bag between your feet, and you listened to the phone ring, and he picked up on the third ring and said your name, and you said nothing for a moment, and he said, "Hey, you okay?" And you said, "Yeah, just calling to check in." And he said, "It's midnight." And you said, "I know." And there was a pause, and he said, "I'm here if something is wrong. You know that, right?" And you said, "I know," and you hung up. And you sat outside for another 10 minutes in the cold. That phone call is the one you revisit most. You could have said something. The door was open and you chose not to walk through it. And that choice lived in you differently than all the others because it was a choice made entirely toward yourself. In February, you found out. Not from Benedetti, from a man named Caruso, the same man who now stands near the kitchen door of this closed restaurant. Caruso sat across from you at a coffee shop near your route and placed a single sheet of paper on the table and slid it towards you without ceremony. It contained information about you, about your delivery routes, about the building you passed 3 times a week that turned out to be relevant to something you had never been told about Marcus's work schedule, about your mother's care schedule. The paper told you that none of this had begun with an unlucky door in an alley. It had begun weeks before that night when someone had been watching a courier who passed a certain building on a certain route and who looked tired and harmless and desperate enough to be useful. The envelope you had delivered to the wrong address had not been misdirected by accident. It had been directed to you. You had been handed a reason to make contact. You were not recruited because you were dangerous. You were recruited because you were invisible, and invisible people can go places that visible people cannot. And nobody questions the red delivery bag on the shoulder of someone who looks like they are simply trying to get home. You tried to leave. Of course you did. You called the number you had for Benedetti and left a message saying you were done. You changed your phone number 2 days later and felt, briefly, the specific relief of someone who has made a decision. That relief lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, Marcus texted you from your old number, which meant someone had given him your old number's contact information before you changed it. Or rather, someone wanted you to know that changing numbers was a gesture and nothing more. Then your mother's hospital contact called your new number to confirm her next appointment, and you realized that the number change was as meaningful as rearranging furniture in a room with no walls. You could not leave because leaving was not a physical act. It was a financial and relational untangling that you no longer had the power to perform. The rent that had been covered, the medical bills that had been quietly reduced through arrangements you had not made yourself. The protection that Marcus had been unknowingly receiving in his warehouse job where 2 incidents of minor workplace harassment had mysteriously resolved themselves. Every kindness had been a thread. Benedetti had spent months weaving them through your life. The gift was always the chain. You were invited to a dinner in March at a private house in the Linwood neighborhood, a wide cream-colored house set back from the street behind a short iron fence. You were told by Caruso that it was informal, that it was simply a gathering. You understood that declining was not an option presented to you. You wore the only clean dress shirt you owned, and you drove there in your car with the fraying delivery bag still in the back seat because you had not thought to remove it. And when you walked in, the house smelled of good food and candle wax and something older that you could not identify. There were perhaps 12 people in the main room, and Benedetti was at the center of it, the way a fixed point is at the center of things that orbit around it. He crossed the room when he saw you and placed his hand on your shoulder and turned to the room and said, "This is someone I trust." And the people in the room looked at you with expressions you recognized from nowhere in your previous life, because they were expressions that contained both welcome and assessment simultaneously, as if being accepted and being measured were the same gesture in this particular world. You smiled because you could not think of what else your face was supposed to do. Later in the evening, a man named Falco, who had been laughing loudly at the table for most of the night, was no longer in the room. Nobody mentioned it. You looked at Benedetti at one point and found him already looking at you, and in that look you understood something that language does not entirely fit. Silence in this room was not absence of speech, it was participation. You had attended this dinner. You had been introduced. You had said nothing about Falco. That was your membership fee, paid without a transaction you could point to. And so you return now to 2:17 in the morning, back in this restaurant with the flickering light and the upturned chairs and the gold lighter between your hands. You know now what you did not know when you first walked into this story. You know the dinner and the envelope and the favors and Marcus and your mother and the man named Falco who disappeared between the main course and the dessert. You know that the lighter on the table belonged to Dario, who is no longer in his seat, and that someone left it there for a reason that functions as a question directed at you. You know that the men in this room are waiting for you to demonstrate that you understand what your silence has cost and what your continued silence is worth. The choice is not presented to you as a choice. It is presented as a formality. You became an informant in April. You went to a federal field office on the fourth floor of a building on Harbor Street, and you spoke to 2 agents for 3 hours, and you gave them what you could, and you told yourself it was courage, and some of it was. But courage purchased at that price has a particular weight. The agents gave you a contact number and a protocol and told you to continue as normal. And continuing as normal meant going back to Caruso and Benedetti and the world you had agreed to report on. And the psychological cost of that double life is something no briefing prepares you for. You lost Marcus in June, not to anything physical, but to the truth when he finally assembled enough of it on his own. He sat across from you at the kitchen table, the same table where you had paid bills online and felt briefly solvent. And he said, "I know something is wrong. I have known for months," and you looked at your hands and said nothing useful. And he stood up and left, and the door closing behind him was the quietest, most devastating sound you had heard since this entire thing began. The case concluded in September. There were arrests. There were proceedings that you were a part of in ways that became public record under a name that was yours but no longer felt like it. Benedetti was not among those charged in the first round. Caruso was. Several others were. The architecture of the organization had more floors than you had ever seen, and the floor you had been standing on turned out to be near the bottom, which meant what you had given them was useful but incomplete. And incomplete meant there were people still out there who knew your name and knew what you had done and did not particularly care, that you had been frightened and broke and trying to take care of your family when it all started. You moved. Once, then again. You work a different job now, something administrative, indoors, away from routes and deliveries and the specific vulnerability of being a person who moves through the city carrying things for other people. You do not speak to Marcus the way you used to. You speak to your mother on Sundays and she asks how you are doing and you say fine. And she tells you that you sound tired and you say you have been sleeping fine, and both of those things are true and neither of them is honest. The red delivery bag is in a box in the closet of your current apartment. You have not thrown it away. You have thought about it many times, have even taken it out of the box and stood holding it in the hallway under the bare overhead light, but you have put it back each time. Someone asked you once why you keep it, and you did not have a good answer that day, but you have one now. You keep the red bag because it is the last object that belonged entirely to the person you were before any of this. Before the envelope, before the warm room, before your name became a word that other people could borrow and spend and return to you slightly different than it had been. You keep it because letting it go feels like agreeing that the person who carried it no longer exists. And you are not ready to agree to that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. That is the most honest thing you still own.